Alright, so I'm going to be talking about domestic abuse in women's voices today. I apologize if I sound a little congested. It's just because I'm a little sick, I think. So, yeah. Alright, so these trauma stories are able to tell a woman's story, and I think that they would also help people who have been through similar situations because they know that they're not alone. But I think these trauma stories, as sad as they are, they're also very real. Very real. But each of them have an undertone of abuse or domestic violence, both mentally, physically. Um, but while these stories are very traumatic and they can be kind of triggering for people who have been through similar stuff, these characters never lose hope and they never let their abuser win. And what I mean by never letting their abuser win is that they don't let them have their abusers still have that power over them after the fact. They were able to overcome it, which I think is an amazing thing because unfortunately I don't think a lot of domestic violence victims are able to say the same thing because of how bad they've either been beat or maybe have even been killed by their abuser, which I think is a very real topic that not a lot of people talk about within America and within our society. So for example, I'm going to talk about the story of Dominique for a little bit. So she had met Nzinga, and Nzinga had moved her from London to the States, and she wasn't allowed to cook. She wasn't allowed to clean, or I don't even think she let her get a job. And while I think Dominique at the time had thought that um, it was like okay because it was so heavily romanticized, which in my next few slides I'm going to go over that too. So I'm not going to say too much on that. But one thing I do want to touch on is that Nzinga wanted to change her name from Dominique to Sojourner after Sojourner Truth, which in theory you think would be like a good thing because it's a strong woman, but I feel like the way that even like when Dominique was like, no, I like my name, and then Nzinga was like, well, I'm still gonna call you that anyways. I think that's also one, not listening to what your partner is saying, but also a form of wanting to control somebody's life so much because you had already isolated them from everybody and took them out of their comfort zone, and you had and on top of that then you want to change her name, and she's like, no, I like my name, but I'm still gonna call you that anyways. I just don't think that that's okay. Dominique realizes this later in life, and she ends up going to therapy. And I would say that she never let Nzinga win because in the end, Dominique was okay, and she was still able to have a somewhat normal life after this relationship. But I definitely think this one did a number on her. Alright, so now I'm gonna talk about Cleophila's story. I don't know if I'm saying her name right, but and this is from Woman Hollering Creek. And so she marries a man named of Juan Pedro, even after her father is very reluctant to marry her, to approve this marriage. But he moves her from Mexico to the States so that they can live together. And in theory, that might sound like a great idea because I think especially to Cleophila's, because she had this type of love that was, a telenovela type of love, like Morticia Adams and Gomez Adams kind of love, like that obsessed, passionate love. Um, and she believes that this is what love is because that's what she was exposed to. And I'm sure that's all she ever wanted to feel from her own husband was that kind of love. But her relationship with him was completely the opposite. Um, I believe she said in the story that the only time she ever really loved him was when they were having sex, or after having sex, I believe. It's one of the two. But her husband also begins to beat on her even while she's pregnant with a second child. But this particular situation isn't the first time that he had beat her. He had beaten her the first time, and she was in such a shock. She was in such like a state of shock that she didn't know how to react. Because, you know, this is some person that's supposed to love you for the rest of your life, and they're not supposed to be beating on you. So I, but I'm gonna go into these on later slides. All right, and then we have Dominique. As I had mentioned in previously in the slides, she was in a relationship with Nzinga, and her life had completely changed when she had met Nzinga. She had really heavily romanticized this relationship to think that, you know, being isolated from almost everybody that she knew and then moving her to America. And well, Nzinga really just wanted to be able to have that control over somebody. Dominique didn't really realize what was happening to her. And her best friend Amma would be like, you need to, you know, like, is this what you really want? Like, being a good friend. But Dominique was like, no, you don't know Nzinga like I know Nzinga. Essentially is what I believe. So once she had realized that what was happening to her and the abuse that was happening to her in her relationship, she had focused. She had eventually gotten out of her relationship and moved back to London and ended that relationship. But she had focused on herself and had such a huge amount of trauma, as anybody would who had that kind of relationship. But she had found support groups and therapy to talk about what she had gone through, and she overcame this toxic relationship, but she wasn't alone. And even when she had moved back to London, she still had Amma and a good support system to heal from that scar of that toxic relationship. All right, so then how these domestic violence victims had grown. So I'm gonna start off with the color purple. So Celie, she had suffered a lot of abuse from men in her life. And the one admirable thing that I believe is that she grows from it and doesn't allow the abuse that she had suffered to define her as a person and define her life. We were able to see all of the abuse that she had gone through throughout her whole entire life throughout that movie. And also how she had found overcome it. So, for example, in the movie, she had sacrificed herself and offered herself to her father so that he didn't have to put Nettie through the same trauma that Celie had to go through. But it wasn't until Celie that met Shug that she was able to gain that confidence and overcome everything that she went through. And I think because she had been so heavily abused by men in her life, that not being abused by women really stuck with her and really gave her the confidence to overcome what she had been through in her life. So and I think really having Shug in her life allowed Celie to enjoy life a little bit more and feel a little bit more happier. But another domestic violence victim in this book, in the story, my bad, sorry, and keep wanting to say book, but is Cleophilas. And the first time that she had experienced abuse in the story, this is a quote from the book. So it says, the first time she had been so surprised she didn't cry out or try to defend herself. She had always said that she would strike back if any man were to strike her. But throughout the story, we can see her trying to protect her husband, even though he's not the nicest person to her. So when she needs to go to the doctor because she's pregnant and she's covered in all these bruises, she protects her husband and says that if the doctors ask, I can just say that, you know, she fell down a few steps or slipped at the back. And now, obviously, I believe that, you know, a doctor is going to see what abuse will look like, medically, at least. So, this doctor's friend had seen the bruises and felt that she should alert somebody. And this person really was a game changer for Cleophilas to overcome her abuse. Because of that woman, that she was able to overcome and get out of that relationship, not only for her safety but also for her children's safety, which I think is really important, because who knows what would have happened if she had stayed in that relationship. She probably would have ended up dead, or their kids would also suffered the extensive abuse as well. And I think this her story is very admirable as well. Sorry. All right. So what we can learn about these systems of privilege and oppression, I believe we can use these stories to learn about, privilege and oppression, by being able to identify who has the privilege and who's the ones being oppressed, because in most of these stories, these male figures have um, this privilege over the minority, which would be women in this case. But for Celie, she was also a woman, but she was also a black woman. So she had suffered a little bit more privilege and oppression from, not only, she got abused by her husband, and her father was sexually abusing her as well, but also being a black woman in like the early 1900s, which really is a different experience from, a white person being abused by their husband and father as well. But she had a little bit more extra of stuff going out for her. But we can learn how to overcome the oppression by using these stories and see how the people that were oppressed had been able to remain strong, while the privilege had looked down upon them. So yeah. So intersectionality. So in The Color Purple, we can see that intersectionality, to understand that African American women are not to be put through the traditional role of discrimination of both their gender and their race, as I was just talking about in that last slide. But we can also see through Celie, we can see it through Cleophila's as well. So she was put in a box the minute that she had gotten married. She had conformed to all of the oppressive standards that she was expected of as being a woman. But she was, again, also a Mexican woman. So she is, again, a minority, especially for the time and the state of the country at the time. So I think she didn't really get a chance to break away from these standards until she had met that doctor's friend who had helped her leave her toxic and abusive husband. So I definitely think that if she didn't go to that doctor's appointment, she would most likely had still been and stayed in that relationship. Alright, so then feminist praxis. So feminist practice is applying one knowledge to challenge those systems of oppression and privilege, as well as discrimination. So we can achieve this by using activism both in person and online, and we can see this in Girl, Woman, Other when Megan Morgan becomes the top LGBTQ plus social media influencer, but we don't see them challenging the system until the after party chapter, which is at the very end of the book. And in the text, it said that they started a campaign against My Festival, which is Dominique, who is talking right now, which was taken up by someone with 1 million followers on Twitter called Megan Malenga, who kept up this attack for months, severely damaging my reputation until I backed down. And so in this case, Morgan was challenging the system of oppression by challenging, the person who was oppressing them at the time, which was Dominique, because she had said those horrible things about the trans community, and was oppressing those who identify as either women and even non-binary women. Or non-binary, my bad, sorry. But that's one example of how we can use feminist praxis to look at the people that are oppressing them. All right. So what we can learn about these from these women's from these women, sorry, from the story is that I think we can learn to never give up hope, and even though what we what women have to go through from the way that some men treat us and um some and society just treats women, I think the message is to never really give up hope. And even though these women have gone through some extremely traumatic events, they never gave up hope. And we can see each and every one of these women fight back to overcome their challenges. I feel like their stories are being told because there are women out there who feel helpless, and if they're up in those oppressive positions. And I think we can also learn that women's voices are being heard as well. So I have this little picture of a sign for I Want to Be Heard, which I would imagine be taken to a women's march, which I think is an amazing thing because we do have a right to say that kind of to say stuff like and our voice is just as important as men. And I think society is starting to recognize this, but we still have people who, for example, like for our former president Trump, who literally would say grab them by their pussy, which is not only very offensive, but very no, it's just offensive. It's offensive all around to women, in my opinion. But I just think, and then that really, when he said that, that really turned a change for the Me Too movement. And, you know, people were starting to come out about it, about, you know, all the horrible things that they have been through by men in power, more importantly. Um, and so I just think what we can really learn from these stories is that we can overcome this stuff as a together, as a group. And we can also, and by using our voice, and we're not going to shut up until we got what we want. That's how I view it, and that's what I learned from these stories. But yeah, thank you for a wonderful semester. I really enjoyed this class.